Well, if that doesn't set the tone. When I first watched Arcane, I was stunned by the animation and the story that I'd just experienced. The way in which the characters interacted with the world and each other was unlike what I'd seen in most other shows that I'd been watching at the time. It took me a few years before I re-examined the show with a more critical eye, as prior to that I'd sort of just accepted that the show's writing was strong due to how well the characters were written. Not to say that this isn't at least a part of the truth here, but character writing isn't necessarily the only or even the biggest reason for why Arcane is so beloved by its fans. I think there's something a bit deeper going on in the show, whether the writers intended on it being there or not. So I'm here to talk about it, because I'm pretentious. Arcane is a show about class society and the ills that plague the lives of everyone involved. Because these issues are caused by the foundational system which Piltover operates on, the status quo that we are introduced to in the show could never end in any other way than violence. What do I mean by this? Simply put, capitalism. Incredibly deep statement to make, surely. How could anybody miss this? But I want to specifically talk about how capitalism, which is the system that Piltover ultimately engages in, creates the entire story that we see in Season 1. As of writing this video essay, the second season hasn't actually come out yet. While I'm skeptical that the writers would write something that would change the entire dynamic of the story from Season 1 to create the sequel, I wanted to make sure that moving forward in this analysis that I'll be discussing only the first season. Now that we've got that disclaimer out of the way, let's get to it. Capitalism, as a system of economics, is actually pretty simple to understand. There are two classes of people within society. There's the owner class, also known as the bourgeoisie. These are the rich, the investors, the people who don't really need a job because their money comes from owning some kind of business. And there's the working class, also known as the wage laborers, the proletariat. You, dear viewer, are most likely a member of this class. Essentially, this is the vast majority of people that exist within class society. Now that we have an expert understanding of the dominant economic model of our own world, let's see how this applies to Arcane and more specifically Piltover. Pretty apt comparison, I'd say. Okay, if we're being fair, aesthetics alone aren't really gonna do it. If we just compare what something looks like, we're actually gonna run into a lot of problems. Vibes-based analysis is bad. Don't do it. So, how do we analyze the society of Piltover as a capitalist one? Or at least confirm what kind of system it even is? Well, I'm glad you asked, ghost of a viewer that doesn't actually exist. I will answer as I speak into the void that is YouTube, forever wondering if my existence even matters. I'm going to first set the stage for our setting, so we know where we are and what's going on in the world of Arcane. Piltover is populated by several houses, some large, some minor, that control all political and economic decisions within a central location. This is called the Academy, where the ruling council has its meetings. The Academy itself is an educational institution as well as the political center of Piltover. as created by Heimerdinger to escape the
warmongering of mages.
Whatever that means. Now that we have a firm grasp of where we are and how the city generally works, here are some examples that I think illustrate the point of Piltover being a capitalist society. When Jace discusses his decisions to close the Hex Gates, Mel makes a point to educate him on different profitable dealings that the larger houses are a part of, and how jeopardizing those has placed a massive target on his back.
Since my parents brought me for the Winterfest.
We're not here for the performance. Your house is in trouble. That merchant formerly enjoyed certain leniencies with regard to her trade in exchange for her generous academy patronage. Oh, look at those two stooges.
Counselors Hoskell and Sella? Don't they hate each other?
But they share a taste for the fine Enoxian spirits, technically an illegal import.
I tightened our security.
And in so doing, put a target on your back.
Silco is referred to as an industrialist.
Silco, the industrialist.
Which is an actual business term used commonly during the Industrial Revolution. Essentially, the implication here is that Silco has made his wealth through private enterprise, likely through manufacturing, which we actually do get to see as he owns factories that produce Shimmer, the magic superheroine that powers Chemtech. Vander himself owns a bar which is used for private criminal dealings by many people in the lanes. While criminality wasn't uncommon in feudalism, the precursor to capitalism, the dealings we actually do see at the last drop seem to be a bit more in line with our modern idea of crime. Not just theft or violence, but actual business dealings that are meant to garner some kind of profit. But it's not just ownership that makes a capitalist society. It's equally important to remember that for every owner, there are far more workers that exist within that system. And while Arcane, the show, seems rather disinterested in showing us what life is like as a general laborer, it's not shy when talking about the miners of the Undercity, the nation of Zon. Time and again, we are confronted with either references to the miners, the toxic fumes of those mines, or direct discussion of a character's past as a laborer within those mines. The miner is really the only actual job that seems to be discussed by the show, likely because it's the most important source of income for Piltover's capital-owning class. Everything in the city is specifically built from the extracted resources of the Undercity mines, which means that if the economic model used to organize society is a capitalist one, exploitation is bound to happen.
I don't know.
And it's not like that's an outlandish statement to make. If we compare our own reality on Arcane's in terms of working conditions of a similar time, or even in many ways today, we see that exploitation plain as day. Prior to the weekend being a given in our modern society, the working class often had to work within factories and other dangerous environments for what amounted to a pittance. This would give rise to the labor movements across Europe and the United States, as well as many workers' revolutions that shook the earth.
Товарищи, рабоче-крестьянская революция, о необходимости которой все время говорили большевики, совершилась!
In our modern day, things haven't gotten that much better. In fact, they've deteriorated. In the United States, the Reagan administration stripped away much of the legal protections and benefits that the working class had due to the New Deal that FDR had put in place. Since then, wages haven't gone up much at all in comparison to productivity and profit. This has created some pretty dire conditions for a lot of American working class. Not to mention if we understand these exploitive conditions are inherent to capitalism, as we have seen in our own history as well as our daily lives, then how does this apply to Piltover? Why does this matter, and how does it relate to the ending of the show? Or better yet, why does it matter that the economic model of Piltover is capitalism, and how does that relate to our lives as well as how the season ends? All of that to justify a YouTube video of a show that's been out for 3 years. I need a hobby. At the beginning of the show, we see the remains of a failed revolution. Led by our hunky bearded daddy, Vander, the people of the Undercity attempted to march across the bridge towards Piltover. The origins of this revolution are largely not spoken of, only really alluded to by Silco and Vander throughout the first season. But if the show's own dialogue is to be believed, it was likely due to the, and I cannot stress this enough, completely inhumane working conditions and environmental damage caused by Piltover's plumbing system. Yes, these people live in Piltover's shit. It's pretty brutal stuff out here, folks. But if we take the context clues that the show throws at us for the flavor of oppression, then we can pretty much surmise here that the people of the Undercity had just about enough of Piltover's exploitation. This was, of course, met with... yeah. Suffice to say, the show begins properly in the aftermath of this failed revolution, where the people of the Undercity largely are relegated to the opposite side of the bridge from Piltover. They continue to live in the toxic fumes of the mines, as well as, again, I don't really know how I could exaggerate this, the actual plumbing of Piltover, which carries chemicals as well as other waste products into the Undercity, all collecting into the sump. This is where we properly meet our plucky heroes. Look, they haven't even had their spirits broken yet. Oh, you sweet summer child. You haven't held a job yet. Nor have you even seen everybody you care about die. Just your parents. Anyway, the Lucky Quartet are doing cute and fun things like parkour and burglary and breaking and entering. Remember this, it'll be very important later. This is all incredibly fun to watch. The show does a great job at getting us into this world with the colorful visuals and the cast of characters introduced. It's actually pretty charming watching these kids try to goon around and emulate their elders at their age. Something that Vi actually makes a point of as to how Vander would have pulled off a job like the one they're doing right now. The reason I bring this specific scene up here, other than the fact that it's at the very beginning of the show and it sets up the plot itself, is that I want to discuss the response to the events of the burglary. Not the police chase, because of course they're gonna get chased by the cops after blowing up a building. I want to discuss what the enforcers do afterwards when they're searching for these kids. See, when we talk about capitalism and how its rules are enforced, we need to also talk about the state. The state, generally, is the actual government of whatever place is operating under a capitalist model. What this means is that the state itself will have a class character to it, meaning that it serves the particular interests of a certain class in that society. In capitalism, the state serves the interests of the capital-owning class, and we actually get to see that pretty clearly in the show. We'll talk about Silco and Marcus's arrangement later. For now, I want to examine the enforcers for a minute and take a look at their role within the class society of Piltover. Because when we talk about the systemic nature of how these different organs of capitalist society work, it's not so much about specific individuals and their importance, but rather how things have been organized and operated that drives events in the story. Much like real life, individual people aren't singularly capable of shifting societal issues. They operate within a system, and this in turn affects the world they live in. So when you have an organization that, through the use of violence, enforces the will of a ruling class over the other, you'll find that the organization's response can be pretty disproportionate depending on who they are looking for. Man, I wonder how they treat someone from Piltover when they break the law.
Imprisonment. What a curious principle. We confine the physical body, yet the mind is still free.
Fuck you, Heimerdinger. What are you even... Anyway, to better illustrate the point, Jace is from a miner house that makes hammers and collapsible pocket watches. This translates to being able to live in Piltover and have a rather privileged life. Most of the materials that House Talus uses are probably mined in the Undercity, meaning that even a small house like Jace's is propped up by the exploitation of the workers of the Undercity. Why is he in jail? Because he's got a bunch of illegal shit in his room without any permits. Now I recognize that accidentally blowing up a building and having contraband in your possession are two very different crimes. It makes sense that the enforcers would respond a little more frantically for an explosion. But here's the thing. What happened to Vi after Marcus captured her at the end of Season 1? Remember, he has no real evidence to show that she was there at Jace's apartment as far as we know. In fact, Marcus even makes a point to whisper to Vi that Silco will kill her if he sees her. The next time we see Vi is in a supermax prison where she gets beaten almost every single day.
How many chats have you had with her?
You know, I never even thought to count.
This supermax prison appears to be populated by Undercity people who haven't even had a trial. Remember, Silco's gangster, after being wounded by Jinx, was thrown into Stillwater without trial as well. It seems like Stillwater Hold is actually a place where Undercity criminals are thrown into, likely given some kind of task to do like cleaning laundry or whatever, and they basically serve out a sentence that was never actually given to them. The police response to the explosion from the burglary as well is to essentially go into the Undercity and harass everybody there. At one point, they throw a man through glass because he refused to answer their questions and spat on Marcus's boot. It's very hard not to conclude that the enforcers of Piltover serve the interests of capital and its benefactors. When a capital owner, even a small one like Jace, offends the societal laws that they live under, they are given some form of trial with the council. They're given time to defend their case, explain themselves, and it seems that even if they are found guilty, there is the chance to get off with nothing but a slap on the wrist. In Jace's case, it's because Heimerdinger favors him and expects the guy to be an excellent scientist someday. The people of the Undercity, however, when any crime that may disrupt Piltover occurs, the entire population has to deal with it via police officers armed with rifles and batons coming in to threaten and even beat them. To the capital owners and their enforcers, the Undercity is collectively guilty to a certain extent. We could see this in the way the enforcers interact with the denizens of the lanes, as well as how one of our protagonists was just thrown into prison without any trial whatsoever. Suffice to say, these guys do not protect the interests of workers in Piltover/the Undercity. Despite the beginning of the story illustrating to the audience that enforcers have killed civilians beforehand, I think it's important to analyze their role in class society through their response to different situations, especially when those responses have such a drastically... God damn it, dude. Especially when those responses have such drastically different tones and methods of enforcement. It helps to understand why enforcers are so despised by the majority of the Undercity, because at first glance, one could maybe be forgiven in thinking that just about everybody in the lanes and the rest of the Undercity is a criminal. After all, the majority of the characters we see in the show genuinely are criminals. But why did they become criminals? What drove these people to break the law and start stealing, fighting, and even killing? Because we have to talk about state violence when discussing capitalism and class society. There's just no way to discuss this kind of thing without addressing how exactly people continue to exist in a society that is so antagonistic towards them. The answer, of course, is state violence. Whether it be the threat of it, which is your police/enforcers patrolling and telling you to watch yourself, or it's actual violence that could be anything from getting evicted to the police busting through your front door and shooting you in your own bed. That is the job of the enforcers in Arcane, just as it is the job of the state in real life. There is a reason the police and the rest of the government are always on the wrong side of history when it comes to workers' rights and civil liberties. One has to remember that every concession workers in the West enjoy today, that being the weekend, a 40-hour work week, overtime, has actually been fought for by trade unions, socialists, communists, and any number of other collective groups that couldn't take the abuses of unfettered capitalism anymore. Civil rights were met with hoses and attack dogs, as well as angry mobs of incredibly racist white Americans trying to beat or kill protesters, while the police basically did nothing or even joined in. Now imagine this is your entire life. Well, you don't actually have to, you're living it right now, you lucky dog. But imagine the violence that enforcers enact onto the Undercity. It could very well be an almost daily occurrence. Maybe it's not, as Vander has a deal with the enforcers to keep them out of the lanes, but we don't know if enforcers are always keeping up with the deal. For now, let's say that they actually do keep their end of the bargain. In real life, many crime bosses have been used as confidential informants, so the police don't actually have to go into an area to do what they normally do, but instead they have a spy. That's Vander. With that, I want to go ahead and discuss different characters and their roles in the story as understood from a class-based lens. I think that if we understand these characters' roles in class society and how their actions are contextualized by that base, we can better understand how conflict in society is born and comes to fruition. Whether it's resistance, criminality, cooperation, or just climbing the ladder, capitalism as an economic system actually creates the conditions that cause characters to make decisions on how to navigate them. As such, we'll be talking less about what exactly each character does and summarizing all of that, and instead we'll be discussing what forces they embody when capitalism continues to be the dominant economic model of a society. So strap in, folks, it's gonna be kinda wild. I promise though, you'll be okay. Probably. National liberation in the modern day is seriously misunderstood by many people, especially those in the Western world. Now, before you hop down into the comments section to tell me about how I'm wrong, just let me explain a bit and maybe we'll learn something together. What do I mean by national liberation? For one, nations and states are two very different concepts, but can often also go together. To differentiate between a nation and a state, it's always a good idea to consider how indigenous people in the United States are often considered a nation or nations, whilst the United States of America is the actual state that presides over them. So while Native American people themselves are a part of a nation, that nation doesn't necessarily have sovereign borders like that of an actual state, such as France, Belgium, Germany, and the United States. So why does this happen? How does a nation actually exist, especially when it's inside of a country's borders? Simple, really. A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people, formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. It seems sort of simple, right? I think with the indigenous people example, I've illustrated the point rather well, but if you need another example, there are the Kurds, the Romani, and African diaspora that also count as a nation. Suffice to say, a nation of people can exist within the state of another country, even one of another nation if that state's character is based on it. How that happens, we're not really going to discuss here because this is page 24 of my script and I'm pretty sure we've barely hit the 1/3 mark of the video by now. But the thing is, just because a nation has been identified, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a national liberation to be held. The astute viewer will likely have noted by now that when a capitalist system is in place, then the next logical step from there is a worker-led revolution. This is what is considered Marxism, the science of class conflict and revolution, essentially. And while normally you'd be right, my smart viewer in the darkness, I have to call to your attention that this isn't exactly always the case. National liberation often occurs because there are two conflicting capital owning classes within a system. There's the smaller capital owners and the locals that are being colonized or oppressed by the actual state, which is owned by the big capital owners. These can be either foreign businesses or they could be the dominant class that developed a state before the oppressed nation. Basically, it's a smaller group of capitalists that have had enough of their more powerful counterparts and want independence for their own markets. I do want to point out that national liberation can also have a proletarian character. It doesn't always have to be about conflicting capital interests, and in fact is entirely capable about the workers of a nation. The reason why it's so important to understand this, and why national liberation is kind of an important concept, is because ultimately it's a progressive force in comparison to the much more violent oppression that these nations experience daily. It's not necessarily ideal, But when you think about it, it's far easier to deal with someone like Silko, whose army is made up of gangsters, rather than Piltover, whose army is well trained, centralized, and follows orders often without question. Without resources being constantly extracted by the oppressive state that is harming the nation, workers in the newly liberated nation state stand a much better chance at revolting against their own capital owner class that is far less developed in terms of state apparatus. Basically, Silkos are easier to kill than Jaces when you're coming from the angle of a Zonite that just spent 8 years in prison with no trial. So what am I building here? Why am I talking about this concept so much? Surely there's a reason for... I'm not going to start this section by saying all the mean things about Silko. I don't really care about whether someone actually wants to argue if he's good or bad, because it actually doesn't matter. Silko's role as a member of the Undercity's wealthier strata, as well as his attempts at independence, are what drive him to take drastic, even cruel actions to achieve his goals. I want to discuss Silko and what he means in the context of capitalist society, and specifically how the relationship between Piltover and the Undercity created someone like him. Despite being one city, Piltover and the Undercity seem to have more of a colonizer-colonized relationship, with physical barriers being put in place against those across Piltover's bridge whenever a threat is perceived. The fact of the matter is that when an Undercity dweller is taken into custody, they don't even have a trial. They simply get thrown into prison. The Undercity and its people are propagandized so heavily against that the council itself believes that they are beyond saving in many instances. When looking at the system of Piltover, I can't help but think of the revolutionary Frantz Fanon and his thoughts on colonization. The colonist sector is built to last, a sector of lights and paved roads, where the trash cans constantly overflow with strange and wonderful garbage, undreamed of leftovers. The colonist sector is a sated, sluggish sector. Its belly is permanently full of good things. But wait! He had something to say in regards to the colonized as well. The shantytown, the Medina, the reservation, is a disreputable place inhabited by disreputable people. You are born anywhere, anyhow. You die anywhere, from anything. It's a world with no space. People are piled one on top of the other, the shacks squeezed tightly together. The colonizer's sector is a famished sector, hungry for bread, meat, shoes, coal, and light. If that doesn't perfectly describe Piltover and the Undercity respectively, I don't really know what else possibly could. It's almost word for word, and you can't make this shit up. Well, they clearly did. Leave me alone. Fuck you. For those unaware, Frantz Fanon was a French psychiatrist who fought as part of the Free French forces in World War II. Afterwards, he aligned himself with the Algerian liberation movement and was exiled for it. The guy knew his stuff as a psychiatrist and political philosopher, as he witnessed himself what colonialism actually does to people. I highly recommend his work, as it's not only deeply moving but also painfully topical still in the year 2024. All of this context, the way colonization works, the dehumanization aspect of capitalism being put to the extreme in cases such as this, is what makes people like Silko. In short, Silko's kind of a bastard, but he's a bastard that was made by his environment. Without Piltover's violent repression of the working class, without the otherization of the Undercity and its people, without the hyper-exploitation of the miners, the toxic gases, and the runoff from Piltover, Silko likely would never have been who he is in the show. Keep in mind, the first scene in the show is... As in, right off the bat, we know that the government has killed civilians, and they are willing to do it again. At one point, Marcus points an actual firearm at a child and only fails to shoot because the ladder underneath him gives out. How many children have been killed by the state at this point? We don't even know. But if the way Piltover's enforcers behave is any indication, quite possibly a hell of a lot. It's important to remember the oppressor's violence when discussing figures like Silko, because despite the diabolical stuff he is portrayed doing, or just alluding to,
had your son killed for this, though I suppose we're ahead on that account. Get out.
There's an infinitely more violent and all-encompassing system that incentivizes behavior like that. When Silco monologues to Vander about becoming the very thing that Piltover fears and hates, he's not exactly wrong. I won't show the clip again, but I keep thinking about the first scene in the show. In this scene, we see a lot of very dead, unarmed people who are only like that because the enforcers shot them. Even if the revolt wasn't exactly being peaceful, I find it hard to believe that these people deserve to be treated this way. It's not like they were in the middle of Piltover rioting. They're on a bridge, and as far as we know, the Undercity begins with topside across the bridge from Piltover, so why would they be killing themselves in an organized revolution like this? Obviously, revolutions aren't always the most organized affairs, but it's hard to imagine that people of the Undercity would be trashing their own homes on their way to beat up their class enemy. Anyway, when we take into account all of the incidents of state violence that we actually witness in the show, it's hard not to understand Silco's logic here. Any attempt at gaining some measure of equality between the exploitive class and the Undercity dwellers is met with violence. If you are caught committing a crime, you are chased with guns and thrown into prison without any trial. If you disrespect the enforcers, they have the ability to fling you through windows and intimidate children without any penalty. Now you might be thinking, but wait, this is kind of similar to how the police operate in real life. I've seen it on the news. Well, you're right there, dear viewer in the void. The police in many countries, especially the United States, do operate in an incredibly violent manner. So much so that they kill people extrajudicially, and not much is actually done to the perpetrator, if anything at all. Don't worry, this will become very important later.
You gonna do anything about that piece of shit that murdered my boy? Let me guess. Jinx'll take care of it.
If that makes you think about what the proper reaction to have in such a reality is, then I'm glad it has, because that was likely the whole point of the way the enforcers treat the Undercity. We may have all just learned something together. But the reason this relates to Silco is because he fills the role of national liberation. See, Silco's a special kind of freedom fighter. He's a business-owning freedom fighter. My guy's local bougie town. He's the big cheese with money. Suffice to say that Silco's attempt at independence for Zon isn't some worker-led revolution. We're not looking at Lenin of Zon here. He's a lot closer to a French revolution than he'll ever be to a Paris commune. Silco is looking to have a free nation of Zon, but free from Piltover, not from the capitalist system itself. I know, big disappointment for us all. I mean, who doesn't prefer a workers' revolution where the resulting state fights for freedom from capitalist encroachment and sabotage? Surely the left won't debate endlessly about the merits of such an experiment. Silco, however much he lacks a workers-led revolution, does actually believe in an independent Zon. I don't really care about the psychoanalysis that I'm sure is seen in what feels like 100 video essays as to why he doesn't have some kind of communist party where he's chairman. I don't really care because I've read too many books at this point and I'm here to critically support Silco. I mean, just look at him. Dude's got some serious drip, damn. Silco is essentially a byproduct of the hyper-exploitive capitalist system of Piltover. Besides the fact that the writers created him this way, Silco as a person is the way he is because of the ultra-violence that the state has wrought upon the people of Zon. We see it at the beginning of the show, and we see it time and again throughout the story, including near the end of the season. Every time Piltover does something dastardly, Silco is proven right for being so heartless in almost every aspect of his life. Almost. If nothing else I have said has made sense, I want to bring up one last example that I think many Western audiences might not understand right away, but once we take a look at the show's own text, I think we'll understand people like Silco and the Chem Barons a lot better. After Jace's police raid is over, Silco and his group are assessing the damage done when we see
You gonna do anything about that piece of shit that murdered my boy. Let me guess. Jinx'll take care of it. Just like she's been taking care of everything else.
It's a pretty harrowing visual, all things considered. And this comes after... Don't worry, we'll get to that little debacle later. The Chem Baron is one of the small capital owners we discussed earlier in the video. She's one of Silco's top people, someone who likely commands her own portion of Zon and is feared and respected. You know what happens to her boy's killer? Nothing really. No, seriously, nothing really happens to this guy. He doesn't get any judicial punishment. No real justice is even attempted for the slaughter of an actual child working in a factory. Jace kind of just gets to walk away and feel guilty about it. But the Chem Baron and her family still have to live with the murder of her son, and the real bitch of it? There is no way for her to get any legal justice. The entire system is stacked against her and every single person in that room. What would happen to her if she tried to get justice for her kid? Most likely, she'd end up in Stillwater without trial and likely never to be let out again. This is the reality of every person in the Undercity. The police and their masters can just gun you down, and there's nothing anyone can do about it in a legal sense. Even in real life, there are situations where you can sue the jurisdiction for some cash, but in the real world of Arcane, it's just tough luck. Better hope you don't get shot. It's a miracle that Piltover hasn't already seen a Silco. Really. And yes, child labor is terrible, but let's remember a couple of things here. Prior to Silco becoming the head guy in the Undercity during Vander's tenure as the most respected man in the area, children were in the streets committing crimes. The second scene of the entire show is just young teens and a preteen scaling buildings to rob a place for money. They mess up the job so badly that it almost causes a war between the gangs of the Undercity and Piltover's enforcers. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Silco eliminated child crime. There's just no way for that to happen under capitalism. It's designed with this element as part of the procedure. But it's not like we see this type of behavior after Vander's death really exhibited by children in the Undercity. Even when Heimerdinger goes into the city, which is a great opportunity for the writers to really beat it into him that his city is sick to its core, the only child character Heimerdinger encounters is an innocent girl that he tries to give a toy to. Through Shimmer, Silco and the Chem Barons have built a certain measure of stability in the Undercity, and gained enough wealth to actually begin messing with Piltover's operations, as seen through the bribing of the sheriff, who allows contraband to be brought in and out of the hex gates when they are created. Remember, the Council does this too, to a much greater scale. This has had some pretty dire consequences for the Undercity. Vi comments how her and her friends would hang out in the Sump, and that this is where the most forgotten people in the Undercity go, but that it wasn't always as full as it is currently. We see that these people are Shimmer addicts, and they're pretty messed up from the looks of it. Nobody said it was perfect. National liberation movements aren't ideal in the very best of conditions, mostly because they arise out of incredibly dire ones at that. But when faced with the violence of the state, like the way Piltover has treated these people, or violence in real life that is actually significantly worse than what is even allowed on TV, it's hard to imagine how someone less extreme would be doing this kind of work. But it's clear that Silco believes his own words. When he's alone with Jinx, one of the only people he really trusts or cares about, he's talking about the nation of Zon.
I'm doing this for us, Jinx. All of us. The sons and daughters of Zon deserve more than their runoff.
He's not being cynical about his motives. They really do tie back to wanting true liberation from Piltover. When he's chastising the Chem Barons later,
we came from a world where there was never enough to go round. Thin. That is why we fight. Do you remember? Please. Don't forget again.
For context, the council has fully stopped transit through the hex gates at this point, and the Chem Barons want Silco to capitulate and cut a deal so their profits aren't hurt so badly. He's doing it because the higher goal above all is to gain national independence, so they don't have to cut a deal. Now you can say that Silco wants to be at the top, that he would never allow anybody to be in charge. Only him. I can't really say one way or the other. It's entirely likely that the guy has the ego for that, but that's not really important here, is it? Silco is fighting for liberation. He is at the top of an organization that would make him the leader of that new nation. That's fine. Really. I don't want to keep beating this dead horse, but I want to share one more quote by Fanon before we switch gears. I think he sums up what Silco is talking about throughout the show and helps us understand him better as a character, as well as his role in the liberation struggle. It should be on screen now. For a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and, above all, dignity. Finally, the guy I really wanted to talk about. Frankly, I hope they don't completely mess up Echo in Season 2. I don't really have the chance to gush over any revolutionary groups in Western media, which is why I kind of just take what I can get where I can get it. See, when situations like the one Zon finds itself in with Piltover occur, you don't just get nationalist movements like that of Silco and company. You also get something a little more community-oriented, something worker-related. Something like...
Say the Black Panther Party that they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary. And you're going to have to keep on saying that. You're going to have to say that I am a proletarian. I am the people. I'm not the pig. You got to make a distinction. And the people are going to have to attack the pigs. The people are going to have to stand up against the pigs. That's what the Panthers are doing. That's what the Panthers are doing all over the world.
Oh yeah, it's gonna be a good time. The Black Panther, the Firelights, are a small, organized group of people in the Undercity that oppose both Silco and the enforcers of Piltover. They're actually pretty cool, for the little screen time they really get. It's probably one of my biggest problems with the show thus far, is just how little time we get with them, considering how important their presence is in Piltover's political landscape here. These guys are quite interesting, actually. They live in a communal area with a goddamn treehouse. They have clean air, space for everybody in their group, and they take care of each other. Their organization seems tight-knit as well. The way Echo and his fellow Firelights act seem to be out of mutual respect, like Echo was chosen to be the leader. He didn't coerce them, at least not that we know of. Now, I'm not trying to sit here and say that the Firelights are a bunch of communist revolutionaries hell-bent on overthrowing capitalism in Runeterra, but the reason I bring up the Black Panther Party here is because, while yes, they were outspoken communists in their time, they weren't just a political party for the workers in their area. They fed children, started literacy campaigns, and famously patrolled their neighborhoods to protect their communities from police brutality. The party was started by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California, due to the state violence that black neighborhoods were suffering at the time. Don't look up how open carry was outlawed through the Mulford Act, by the way. It definitely isn't important. At any rate, the reason why Echo and the Firelights are so important is because they are the exact force I'm talking about here that stands a chance at overthrowing a nationalist like Silco. Let me explain. If the Firelights were big and bad enough to actually overthrow Piltover and had the movement, resources, and people's will behind them to do it all, I'd be the happiest audience member in the entire digital theater that we collectively call our living rooms. But they're not. The Firelights, despite having carved out a little space for themselves in the Undercity, and they do have a relatively safe community that likely practices some form of collectivist distribution, they're still a tiny group. The Firelights also mostly oppose Silco's operations, but they also get into fights with the Enforcers. So what's going on here? Why exactly are these two groups fighting each other rather than working together? Surely they have way more to gain working together rather than being at each other's throats.
I'm leaving. I've assessed the situation and I'm going.
Where are you going?
Just leaving.
But where?
I have to return some videotapes.
Well, unfortunately for the unity of Zon, the Firelights were created to combat Silco and his drug game. Another similarity between the Black Panthers and the Firelights, to be sure, as the Black Panthers actually did rob drug dealers from time to time. But because the Firelights don't really get much screen time here, we don't really know anything about their politics. We kind of just have to go with what we get in the show throughout context clues. It's why I'm hoping for more Firelight screen time in Season 2. They're the most interesting group in Zon. They seem to have it figured out in terms of treating each other and the people well, but also that you can't really build such a space through regular channels within Piltover's system. They literally have to find a place and hide in it, while cultivating the land as best they can. Now, I doubt that the Firelights in Season 2, if they were to get a ton of screen time, would be quoting Mao or Lenin. But from what we see in this show, it's not like they're that far off from being the fledgling workers' party that overthrows the system that put them all in poverty bondage. At least that's my hope. What about the man himself, Echo? Well, he's the leader. He's the poor kid on the street, around the same age as Powder. He lost his parents in the failed revolution, just like Powder and Vi, and eventually turned to a life of crime, just like Powder and Vi. But why is Echo so different from his basically older sisters? Well, it boils down to the character of his actions. As we just discussed, the Firelights are primarily concerned with combating the drug game in the Undercity and with helping the people of Zon no longer live in such horrible conditions. This includes fighting the actual police. That's why they have the tree, and that's why they keep each other close. They have built an unlikely family in the sewers of Piltover, and they're doing it for the people. Echo isn't all that different from... Not only were the Black Panthers dealing with heavy police violence, but they also were dealing with the rising violence in their neighborhoods due to poverty and systemic racism. I wonder how this could have happened. Sorry, I don't mean to get off track. This in no way has anything to do with Arcane at all. Nothing at all. So basically, the Firelights and Echo had material issues they wanted to address, and the situation essentially forced them to take a whole other character than that of a capitalist like Silco, or any of the council members. They're some of Piltover's most oppressed people, in the deepest reaches of the Undercity. Echo owns no property, and in all likelihood has no money. In fact, the entire Firelight headquarters is likely not owned by any one member of the group. Trouble is, without Marx to explain to them how to do everything right, they'll just never be able to do anything. That's why they need to read the Manifesto right now! Or really, they're just not there yet. Like we discussed earlier, the Firelights don't really have much to say in terms of politics. It's really just going by their actions that we can even figure out what they stand for. And even then, it's pretty light stuff. It's easy to be against oppression and drug-related violence. I don't really know a lot of people that are all for the continued destruction of their communities. But hey, who knows? Maybe you know a Patrick Bateman. So why am I so excited about these guys? What is it about Echo that makes me so frickin' eager to talk about him and his potential later in this story? Before talking about this specific part of Echo's story, I need to talk about someone very special. Because without her, Echo and his future storyline might not be quite so exciting. Oh, Caitlin, please don't torpedo whatever goodwill I may have left in this video. I'm just kidding, I do what I want. Caitlin is an interesting character. She's a member of the capital-owning class, as she's the daughter of a wealthy household that sits on the Council of Piltover. She's old money. She gives us an incredible insight into a world that most of us will likely never even see, because of how stratified our class societies are in real life. But the thing about Caitlin and her disposition is that it's not that different from many people living in what we would call today Western liberal democracies. See, as she lives on the correct side of the bridge, she has incredible privilege. Bars? Not just because she's wealthy, but she doesn't live in the shanty town of the Undercity. She is protected by the enforcers against the Undercity. She is alienated from the average working class member of Piltover. Keep that word in mind, alienation. It'll be important later. See, as Caitlin happens to come from such a wealthy family in such a high status position within Piltover society no less, she isn't really wanting for much. Her material needs are met every single day. A home to sleep in, food in the belly, and away from any danger that you could think of, really. None of this is a point against Caitlin. We don't choose where we were born or who we were born to. It's not exactly cool to rag on people for living a safe life due to their circumstances. However, because of her position in class society, we see Caitlin struggle to fit within that mold. As a child, she has a more rebellious nature and wants to be taken seriously as a person. This isolation from other people, as seen with how her family could just revoke her ability to maintain friendships, creates a sense of alienation from society and community for Caitlin. What happens next, however, is telling about what privilege and the alienation of capitalist society can create so easily. Yup, it's adventurism! Oh no! Alright, what am I even talking about? Well, pretty simple really. Caitlin engages in politics through policing for a sense of adventure and attempting to self-actualize. To her, going out into the real world means joining the gendarmes, the police. Keep in mind, we've seen these people commit horrendous acts of violence already, and we see their leader try to kill a teenager who's basically waving a white flag of truce with that gem in his hand. That's a pretty rich idea to have, basically. At least, that's what most of the people of the Undercity would say. But to Caitlin, well, that's just how society is. There are criminals afoot, and they have to be caught to make sure that society runs smoothly. If this worldview sounds familiar, that's because it is. But where does this actually come from? I mean, we've been talking about the capital-owning class and their state, but what exactly drives this narrative? And why is it such a prevalent viewpoint in the modern-day West? Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci actually has an interesting theory on the subject, that of cultural hegemony, which states that the dominance of a culturally diverse society by the ruling class who shapes the culture of that the beliefs and explanations, perceptions, values, and more, so that the worldview of the ruling class becomes the accepted cultural norm. I won't go into too much detail here because Gramsci also makes distinctions between the state and private life, and how the ruling class uses these concepts to push cultural hegemony down into the homes of every working class member of society. If you want to read more on that, Gramsci's prison notebooks are an excellent start if you're jonesing for some Italian Marxism. I promise they're cool. Suffice to say, the rich and powerful use their resources to influence society so that their values and ideas are accepted as just facts. This can lead people to making terrible, horrible errors in their political work. Some of us who believe in capitalist cultural hegemony might even write things that are just outright silly. Twice. Now that we understand what the hell it is that Gramsci's talking about, we can take a look at Caitlin to better understand not only the bougie worldview, but the average real-life imperial citizen as well. So strap in, folks, it's gonna be a mindfuck for sure. Everything we see in Piltover when discussing not just the Undercity, but also business and property, runs through a capitalist lens. Constantly. From backroom trade agreements to lavish mansions, we are inundated with an abundance of information that the society is one of class, that it runs in a specific way, and it must continue to be run that way lest profit be harmed. Don't believe me? Here's what the council members have to say at the mention.
Jace has brokered a peace with Silco in exchange for the Undercity's independence.
What?
You can see it in the way Marcus treats the people of the Undercity when he goes to the last drop. Side note, the only reason he's even alive at the end of the scene is because he's got a badge and a gun. And yes, Caitlin herself has a massive, big yellow sign blinking on her forehead, signaling that she is also someone who believes in this cultural hegemony. What do I mean by this? Well,
She'd do anything to keep me from seeing the real world.
Oh, and?
It's a misunderstanding. They think you work for Silco.
Your people hunt us. Like animals. Silco pays them to do it.
That's not possible. You're wrong.
Say that one more time.
One more, I swear.
You know what else reflects on the council? It's citizens living on the streets, being poisoned, having to choose between a kingpin who wants to exploit them and a government that doesn't give a shit.
You get the picture. Kate's someone who really believes in the system and how it's organized. She believes that the real world, as she puts it, is different from the life she lives, and she thinks that by becoming a police officer, she can interact with it. She uses titles of businessmen like Silco because she isn't privy to his criminal dealings, but the sheer surprise on her face when she and Vi discuss Silco is kind of amusing. Thus far she knows, Silco's just some business guy from the Undercity, and his ties go all the way up to the council itself. To her, the system has designated Silco with a respectable title, and that's good enough. It's why Vi dismisses her ignorance, and it's also why... So I skipped over this scene in Echo's section because we needed to talk about Caitlin and cultural hegemony for a bit. I've seen this argument Caitlin makes to Echo before, actually, in my own life. I've also seen this type of argument and person very recently due to some interesting current events. But that's neither here nor there, I assume is what the average centrist might say. Side note, I don't even know if I used the word nor there properly. Any English majors in the chat, please let me know. You can leave George Orwell out of the discussion. I already read his book 1964 and thought it was a very interesting take on Britain's oppressive oligarchy. Anywho, I'm going to show the clip now. I'll probably have to edit it down so I don't get copyright claimed, but it's a pretty interesting conversation to say the least.
Echo, it's wrong what's been done to you. But if you do, this cycle of violence will never stop. This is our best shot at setting the record straight. This city needs healing. More than I ever realized. Please, let me help you.
Some of you may not see the problem with what Caitlin is saying, and that's fine, I guess. No, but seriously, it's okay if your initial reaction is to think that Caitlin has a point. She sounds almost reasonable here, even concerned about the future safety of Echo's people. But there are a few issues with this, and this is specifically why cultural hegemony was such an important point of discussion just a few minutes ago. Caitlin is a cop, not just any cop, but one that's armed with what appears to be military-grade weapons. These cops are, as we know, being paid by Silco to hunt down the Firelights, and they also serve the council who has suppressed revolutions in the past. We see throughout the show before and after this scene how the gendarme of Piltover are able, willing, and actually do commit horrible acts of violence against unarmed people. Marcus points a gun at a literal minor earlier in the timeline of this story. A minor who is running away, not to mention him shooting a teenager. It's not really on Echo to stop the cycle of violence. He, like Silco and every other person in the Undercity, is being violently repressed by the system that Piltover operates on. Caitlin's position as a police officer, as Vi even says she believes what she says, makes it incredibly difficult for her to really see how impossible her argument truly is. Even before the Hex Stone, enforcers have been sent down to the Undercity to cause chaos due to 4 teens messing up a burglary. And while yes, an explosion in the middle of downtown might be alarming, I don't see how turning on an entire city's worth of people and shaking them down for these 4 is really helpful to law and order. These guys only really ever go out to hurt people when the threat of uprising is present, or when capitalist property has been damaged in some way. It doesn't really seem to matter how it happens, just that if anything occurs across the bridge from Piltover, your justice is going to have to be street justice. Unless, of course, you make the trek over and cause trouble. Then, they'll try and kill your daughter. Echo is likely aware of this. It's hard to imagine someone in Echo's position not really understanding that whether he gives up the gemstone or not, the system will continue to abuse him and his people. It will continue to send the violent arm of the state after him, whether it be through Silco's bribes or the council's orders, and one day he could very well die from it. And Caitlin wants him to give up the only possible weapons advantage him and the Firelights may very well have for the foreseeable future to fight not only the Enforcers, but Silco too. To anybody in Echo's position, this is a laughable ass. No, wait, what are you doing? Ah, youth and inexperience. Don't worry, you'll learn. Learned. And that's Caitlin's role, really. She's not just an example of the bourgeoisie's lifestyle. That statement would be such a disservice to her character. She's the example of how the ruling class actually controls the state, and how their ideas propagate through the institutions of capitalist society. But Caitlin is not the only avatar of capital. No, no, no. It's time we finally talk about him.
I'm too sexy for my shirt, too sexy for my shirts.
What is it about Jace and his muscles, I mean character, that is so important that he deserves his own section? He's new money, that's why. We'll get to that. Jace is the example of work hard and you too can become rich. He started off as the son of a small house, and he ends up becoming the leader of Piltover. The shining example of how pulling yourself up by your bootstraps pays off. Sorry, Victor, you don't count. We know you're dying because of the toxic gases in the fissures from where you grew up, but let's not be too rash in our actions, okay? That's not important right now, but Victor will be in just a moment, I swear. Jace is the guy that believes he can do good for society if he could just convince the right people to listen. If you can just win in the marketplace of ideas, you can change the hearts and minds of powerful people and steer society in the right direction. God, I wish I lived in whatever world Jace thinks he lives in. You know how it is. This clearly does not happen at all. But it's not just the fact that Jace can't convince the council to do gooder in being nice to the Proles. It's that the only reason he's in his position is because his technology makes them profit. See the scenes of Mel and Jace on backroom trade deals and the council's reaction to shutting the Hex Gates. Why? Because it'd be redundant to show them again, and I'm hoping to finish this script before the end of June, which I did, but I'm recording in August. Anyway, I do want to talk about Jace's mindset as well as how it plays out in the material world he lives in. I think that with our understanding of cultural hegemony, as well as the capitalist system itself, we can see why Jace is completely incapable of achieving his goals in this season. Whether this changes in the next season or not, I have no idea. I sincerely hope not. That'd mean the writers are lying to us. Let's just start with how Jace and Victor want to develop Hex Tech to help the people of the Undercity. This is actually an admirable goal, one that I'm pretty sure a lot of engineers and scientists have when they begin their journey down the scholastic rabbit hole of academia before being met with their first quantum mechanics or dynamic systems class. But the issue with Jace's vision, and possibly Victor as well, is that it's not really helping the Undercity in any real way. We've seen the Undercity several times. We've seen orphans running around committing crime, drug addicts in the streets, gangs basically being the government. Jace's solution to these massive issues is not to start a food program, or to get a needle exchange going, or even maybe like a housing system that would keep people off the streets. Nope, it's to make these.
The Atlas Gauntlets. The mining colonies in the fissures can work faster and without fatigue.
Now, I don't know about you, but my first thought when I saw this was not how awesome Jace's mind is, but rather how completely divorced from reality he really is. Keep in mind that historically, automation has actually led to workers being fired because less people now can do this job. No, I'm not an anti-technology person. That's a really reactionary stance to take. Once something has been invented, it's real now. It's not going away anytime soon. But these workers in all likelihood live off the wage labor that they get from their work in the mines. Without that job, we don't really see much else in the Undercity in terms of work except being a sex worker and maybe working in a bar. But Vander owned the last drop. Maybe there's servers in restaurants? Suffice to say, without more information on the actual legal forms of work in the Undercity, it's hard to discern how bad it would be for the workers to be unemployed. But considering just how important mining in Piltover is, since it's literally the only profession discussed when referring to the Undercity, I have my doubts that there's much of anything that pays even close to that without breaking the law. At any rate, Jace's innovation has made it more efficient and easier to mine the materials required for Piltover to survive. Bravo! So how about cleaning up the toxic waste and gases in the fissures? I'm sure there wouldn't be any repercussions for all of that. Well, shit. We can see cultural hegemony in motion right here with this specific scene. Really. Instead of improving the actual conditions that people live in, Jace's idea of improvement is making it easier for them to work. I'm not saying that this is necessarily a bad idea. Making things run smoother is always welcome, especially in an arduous job like mining for Piltover. Just look at how the Chem Barons reacted to the gases from the mines after years of cleaner air. But without even putting a band-aid on the issue that the contradictions of capitalism creates, Jace is really just creating more potential criminals in the Undercity, or at bare minimum, more impoverished people. This, of course, assumes that the mines pay a decent wage in comparison to other jobs, which is a dubious assumption. The show doesn't really give us an hourly rate here, so who really knows? I can't imagine that losing your job in the Undercity would be a great position to be in, though. Unemployment is when hot women knee you in the face, though, so I guess it can't be all that bad. Yes, Civica is unemployed. Working for a crime boss as a fixer and top gal isn't an actual wage job. Usually. Side note, I think I'd like to create an entire video on Civica as a character and her role in a revolutionary struggle, but let's just move on for now because I don't have time. But it's not just that Jace's inventions are straight up not helping the Undercity's people. He eventually just stops trying altogether. After becoming head of the council, Jace pretty much abandons the notion. Not intentionally, mind you. There's just too much going on for him as the head of the entire city for him to really focus on this stuff. Since it kind of goes against the entire point of his job, which is to keep the capitalist machine running so that technology and profit can continue to advance and grow. Victor even comments on their failure to do good for the people.
In the pursuit of great, we fail to do good.
I know many people really dislike Silco and all, which is why Vi helps lead this police raid into his factory. Jace feels powerless because the council refuses to do anything about Silco, and Vi offers him the opportunity to exert control over the Undercity. Now this was an accident. It should be remembered that Jace likely didn't go into the raid with the intent to go kill children. But I have to bring up the fact that the shimmer-suited people in the factory are also people. Arcane may take place in a fantasy, steampunk-esque world, but most of the characters seem to be human, and even the non-human ones are very clearly sentient and sapient and have their own personhood that is respected by characters in this show. These chem guards appear to be supercharged shimmer addicts that either work in the factory or lay in hibernation ready to defend it should the need arise. Messed up? You betcha. Tack that onto the many dark things Silco has done in the quest for independence. But let's think about this for a second. Here we have the state rushing into someone's private property based on the word of a criminal that was thrown into prison by Piltover's own police. And remember, she had no trial. They came in with guns, energy weapons, and insider knowledge on the factory and the people associated with it. They do this after they find out who Jinx is and how she has the gemstone. Jace, as a member of the bourgeoisie, cannot allow for these poors and cutthroats to have the advantage. To him, it's dangerous, and in the wrong hands can lead to horrible outcomes for Piltover. Not so different from how Heimerdinger once felt about the technology as well. But his solution to the issues at hand, even after hearing about the horrible conditions his city's people live under, is to rush into a violent situation with guns and, well, it's the same response every single time the workers gain any measure of an advantage. What the show Arcane does masterfully is give us the perspective of the different people in a stratified class system may have, but what's even more impressive is that, through Jace, we see exactly how that class society warps even the most well-intentioned people into child murderers.
You've always been a part of this. You just never had to look it in the eye. One dead kid? There's hundreds more where he came from, thanks to Silco and thanks to people like you who stuck their heads in the dirt.
This is over.
Not for me.
I couldn't agree more, Vi. Just wish you weren't a class traitor. I want to talk about one more scene before we finish, because after watching the show several times so I could try and understand what this feeling of ennui was about in regards to the show, I think this was the scene that really got to me.
I never would have given you to them. Not for anything. You're perfect.
Yeah, this scene. A lot of people I know have mentioned this scene as the one where Silco was truly humanized. The way he comforts Jinx in his final moments, the person who shot him, and how he admits that he just couldn't give her up, how he shows his love for her in his final moments. It's truly a scene that makes my black heart choke up a little bit. But that's not what this little section is about. What this section is about is what this scene represents. See, I don't think Silco was broken by capitalism the moment Jace demanded Jinx as a trade for independence. No. I think Silco was broken the day Vander betrayed him. The thing about capitalism is that it requires alienation to persist throughout society, both at the individual level and at the macroeconomic level. Alienation from our friends, family, community, our labor, our creations, everything. It breeds a toxic competitive culture and mindset that leads to conflict with our own personal lives, as well as large-scale wars. You can't harm each other if you really empathize with each other. So the point is to make you, the worker, not care and not feel about your fellow man. So when Silco, a revolutionary, lost his brother in arms against Piltover through betrayal, I think that was probably the moment his entire life was truly shattered. You don't become a Silco on day one. It takes years to get there, 1,000 cuts and 1,000 more, to become so ruthless and cold that you can't allow anyone in. And yet, the moment he saw a child like him, someone abandoned and alienated by those around him, his defenses melted away for an instant. I know it, you know it, hell, even Savika knows it. The only person in the whole world that Jinx felt she could rely on was killed by her. But she was only in this position because she was orphaned by Piltover, and Silco's infighting with Vander, of course. I think this is where a lot of people get twisted up, because it's not about the individuals here. It's about how none of this even had to happen. How Vander and Silco never should have needed to start a revolution. How the people of Zon never should have had to work in toxic mines. How children shouldn't have to rob apartments to survive. How addiction to substances doesn't need to be treated so horribly, and how people should not be thrown in prison and placed in such terrible conditions. None of this had to happen. In the final moments before Zon's independence, the leader of Piltover's bourgeoisie demands a daughter of Zon.
You'll discontinue the production of Shimmer.
Have there already?
And I need Jinx. She has to pay for what she's done.
They weren't her crimes. She was working for me.
After everything, after murdering her parents, hell, a lot of people's parents, after taking away friends and family, after throwing countless people into prison, likely with no trial, after breaking their own rules on trade, after killing a child worker, Jace demands a daughter of Zon, Jinx, Silco's one and only lifeline. The day capitalism broke Silco was the day it got Vander to betray the revolution. But the day capitalism killed Silco was the day it demanded his daughter for Zon's freedom. Because the blood that was already spilled was just not enough for them. Because no matter how many guns you have, no matter how many people you have, it's never enough. The only thing capital understands is what it demands, and the workers suffer for it every day. The only thing that gets the workers through it all, the only way they ever win, is loyalty to their class, their people. And whatever can be said about the dark actions of Silco and those who are like him in real life, I think that his final words speak volumes more of how there are just some things you simply cannot bend the knee to. And so when Jinx stands up, her soul ripped from her body, likely forever, I don't blame her for firing a missile into the council chambers. When it hits, that is the moment when class antagonism is at its peak, and the only thing to blame here is the system itself. This is the moment where we see that this peace agreement was never going to work. If they didn't ask for Jinx, it would have been something else, because capital can only consume and grow. It cannot feel. It is squarely positioned against the concept of humanity itself. It takes away everything it can, stripping you of your sense of self in the quest of ever-expanding growth. It takes away your family, whether it be chosen or by blood. I think that with the way Piltover's system was organized, the ending of Season 1, or at least some form of it, was always inevitable. Because disregarding all of the larger picture theoretical stuff we've discussed, on a very personal level, capitalism strips us of our very essence, our love, our lives, our families. And I think that this show teaches us one valuable lesson above all else, and that is if we are willing to pay attention.
You feel, however, that we're making progress in this country and worldwide?
No. I will never say that progress is being made. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress is healing the wound that's a blow made. And they haven't even begun to pull a knife out, much less try and heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there.